Madrid, November 6, 1661. The palace was hushed, heavy with anticipation. From the great hall down to the dimly lit servants' quarters, every ear strained for news. Queen Mariana of Austria was in labor, and the stakes could not have been higher. Spain's empire stretched across continents, from silver-rich Peru to the bustling ports of Manila, but its very future balanced on this single birth. If the queen failed to deliver a living male heir, the Habsburg dynasty in Spain risked collapse. For 2 days, Mariana had endured an excruciating struggle. Witnesses spoke later of her cries echoing through the stone corridors, muffled prayers rising from chapels as monks begged heaven for mercy. The queen herself was only in her 20s, but years of stress, grief, and the oppressive shadow of dynastic expectation had aged her prematurely. She had already buried multiple children. Now all hope rested on this one. Finally, after an agonizing ordeal, the child emerged. He was male, a fact that immediately brought relief to King Philip IV, courtiers and clerics alike. The continuation of the dynasty, at least for the moment, was secured. Yet when midwives and doctors examined the infant, their smiles faded. The boy's head was oddly shaped. His jaw protruded forward at such an angle that feeding him seemed a daunting challenge from the first hour. His tongue appeared oversized, impairing his ability to suckle. His tiny frame trembled with weakness. Even his cries seemed faint, as if life itself was reluctant to fully take hold. Rumors began to swirl almost immediately. Had God cursed the Habsburg line? For Philip IV, the birth was both triumph and forewarning. The king was by then a weary figure, decades into a reign marked by military decline and economic ruin. Spain was no longer the dominant superpower it had been under his grandfather Philip II. Yet the monarchy's survival still depended on producing heirs. Philip himself had buried his firstborn son, Balthasar Charles, years earlier, a devastating blow to the dynasty. The survival of this new infant, christened Charles, became a matter of near religious significance. But those who looked closely at the child could see the truth. Charles was not the fresh hope of a reborn empire. He was the visible product of centuries of calculated, unrelenting inbreeding, the legacy he inherited. To understand why this single birth was so fraught with tragedy, one must step back through generations of the Habsburg dynasty. For nearly 2 centuries, the Habsburgs had pursued a deliberate policy of intermarriage among cousins, uncles, nieces, and even closer relations. The goal was simple: preserve power, keep territories united, and prevent rivals from diluting the bloodline. The motto of their most famous ancestor, Maximilian I, summed it up perfectly: Bella gerent alii, tu felix Austria nube. Let others wage war, you happy Austria marry? By the 17th century, this strategy had indeed made the Habsburgs the masters of a sprawling empire. Yet the cost was written in their DNA. The so-called Habsburg jaw, a severe mandibular prognathism, had become the dynasty's most recognizable trait, exaggerated with each passing generation. Portraits of Charles's ancestors show the progression. What began as a slightly elongated chin in the 1500s had, by his father's time, become a grotesque deformity that hindered speech and chewing. Charles inherited not just the jaw but the entire burden of genetic concentration. Modern geneticists calculate that his inbreeding coefficient was 0.254, meaning more than 25% of his genes were identical by descent. That figure is higher than the child of siblings who would measure 0.25. In other words, Charles II was more inbred than the offspring of a brother and sister. Spain holds its breath. At the time, however, no one spoke in the language of genes or coefficients. Explanations for Charles's frailty were theological, not scientific. Some whispered that Spain's obsession with defending Catholicism, its crusades, inquisitions, and wars, had brought divine punishment. Others saw Charles as a test of faith. If he survived, it would be proof of God's favor. In the palace, physicians attempted treatments by the standards of the day. Bleeding, purging, herbal concoctions, even relics pressed to the child's body. Nothing made him stronger. By his first birthday, it was already evident he was unlike other royal infants. He struggled to crawl, his head disproportionately large, his muscles weak. Servants carried him constantly, fearful he might collapse if left unaided. Yet despite these obvious signs, official proclamations painted a different picture. Court bulletins described a robust and promising prince. Artists commissioned to paint his likeness softened deformities, flattering the boy's appearance. Spain's enemies, especially France, must not suspect weakness at the heart of the Habsburg monarchy, an empire's fragile future. For Spain, the stakes could not have been higher. The 17th century had brought steep decline. Military defeats at Rocroi and elsewhere signaled the end of Spanish invincibility. The once endless silver streams from the Americas dwindled as mines flooded and production slowed. Inflation gutted the economy, peasants starved, and revolts shook the empire's far-flung provinces. Through all of this, the monarchy remained the one unifying symbol of Spain's greatness. The king was the linchpin of Catholic unity, the chosen protector of Christendom. If Charles failed, if he died childless, or if his rule proved disastrous, centuries of Habsburg dominance would unravel. In truth, the unraveling had already begun. Charles's birth was not the start of decline but the culmination of it. He embodied the dynasty's fatal flaw, a refusal to look beyond blood purity, even at the cost of survival. A life foretold. Superstitious courtiers whispered about omens surrounding his birth. A comet had been sighted over Madrid. Storms rattled the city in the days before labor. Some claimed Mariana had fainted during the baptism, a sign of the child's cursed destiny. Whether believed or not, these tales reinforced the perception that Charles's life was bound up with Spain's fate. Every illness he suffered, every delay in his development, every pale and trembling appearance before the public became a matter of national consequence. And so, from his very first breath, Charles II was less a child than a symbol. He was the product of centuries of marriage contracts inked in candlelit halls across Europe, treaties sealed with kisses between cousins, dynastic unions pursued with ruthless calculation. He was both heir and warning, the living proof that a family, and by extension an empire, could consume itself from within. The people of Spain celebrated his birth, prayed for his strength, and placed their hopes upon his frail shoulders. Few could have imagined just how much misery, paranoia, and tragedy would follow this miracle child. Yet to modern eyes, the signs were clear from the beginning. Charles II of Spain was doomed before he ever left the womb. To understand the tragedy of Charles II, one must trace the roots of his family centuries backward, to a time when the Habsburg name was synonymous with cunning strategy rather than genetic decline. Their rise was no accident of fortune. It was the product of one of the most audacious dynastic experiments in European history, an experiment that began in medieval Austria and, for a time, reshaped the map of Europe. From counts to kings. The Habsburgs began as relatively minor nobles in what is now Switzerland. Their ancestral castle, Habsburg, perched above the Aare River, gave the family its name. By the late Middle Ages, they had carved out territories in Austria and along the Danube, positioning themselves as ambitious players in the shifting politics of the Holy Roman Empire. What set them apart was not military conquest but marriage. While other dynasties waged bloody wars for land, the Habsburgs perfected the art of marrying strategically. Their philosophy could be summarized in the Latin verse often attributed to Maximilian I. Bella gerent alii, tu felix Austria nube. Let others wage war, you happy Austria marry? The wisdom of this motto would define the dynasty for centuries. Maximilian I, the marital architect. The true architect of the Habsburg ascent was Maximilian I, Holy Roman Emperor from 1493 to 1519. A shrewd and restless man, Maximilian inherited modest Austrian lands but dreamed of far greater dominion. He pursued that dream not by leading armies, but by negotiating betrothals. In 1477, he married Mary of Burgundy, heiress to one of the wealthiest and most powerful territories in Europe. This union brought the Habsburgs control over the Low Countries, modern-day Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. Through careful arrangements, his descendants married into the crowns of Spain, Portugal, and Bohemia, weaving a vast network of alliances. By the time of his death, Maximilian had laid the foundations for an empire that stretched across the continent without a single decisive battle. Charles V, master of Europe. The most dazzling product of Maximilian's marriage strategy was his grandson, Charles V. Through a tangled web of inheritances, Charles became ruler of Spain, Naples, Burgundy, the Netherlands, Austria, and, after his election, the Holy Roman Empire. By 1519, his realm spanned not only Europe but also the New World colonies and parts of Asia. It was said that the sun never set on Charles's domains. His empire was so vast that he joked he spoke different languages depending on his audience. Spanish to God, Italian to women, French to men, and German to his horse. Charles V was the most powerful man in Europe. Yet he was also one of the earliest and clearest examples of what Habsburg inbreeding could produce. The early signs of a problem. Charles's parents, Philip the Handsome of Habsburg and Joanna of Castile, were first cousins. Their son inherited the distinctive Habsburg jaw to a striking degree. His lower mandible jutted so far forward that his teeth could not meet. He had difficulty chewing and speaking clearly. While Charles was intellectually capable and politically formidable, he suffered from poor health throughout his life. He endured gout, seizures, and depression. His inability to chew properly left him reliant on soft foods, often aggravating his digestive troubles. Here, in the body of Europe's most powerful emperor, the costs of the Habsburg experiment were already evident. But power overshadowed health. For his contemporaries, Charles's jaw was a minor inconvenience compared to his vast authority. No one yet imagined that these physical quirks were symptoms of a deeper genetic crisis brewing within the dynasty. The Great Divide, Austria and Spain. Charles V eventually abdicated, overwhelmed by the burden of ruling such a sprawling empire. In a carefully orchestrated succession plan, he split his domains. His brother, Ferdinand I, inherited the Austrian and Central European lands, continuing the Austrian Habsburg line. His son, Philip II, took Spain, the Netherlands, and its overseas colonies, establishing the Spanish Habsburg branch. From this moment onward, the two Habsburg branches maintained close ties, too close as history would prove. Marriages between the Austrian and Spanish cousins became routine, ensuring that the bloodlines, instead of branching out, repeatedly folded back upon themselves. Why marry within the family? To modern eyes, the Habsburgs' obsession with cousin marriage seems reckless. But in their world it was seen as prudent. Dynastic unions were political contracts. A marriage between two cousins from rival houses might secure loyalty, merge wealth, or prevent war. For the Habsburgs, the stakes were even higher. Their empire was so vast and their enemies so numerous that any dilution of family control seemed dangerous. By marrying within their own extended family, they kept territories united under the Habsburg banner. There were also religious motives. As champions of Catholicism, the Habsburgs saw themselves as God's chosen rulers. Marrying outside the faith, especially into Protestant houses, was unthinkable. The pool of acceptable candidates narrowed further, making cousin marriage not just expedient but seemingly inevitable. The genetic trap. What the Habsburgs did not understand was the long-term danger of this policy. Repeated cousin marriages increase the chance that harmful recessive genes will pair up, leading to birth defects, physical deformities, and infertility. While occasional cousin marriages may not pose immediate danger, the Habsburgs pursued the practice relentlessly for generations. Instead of refreshing the bloodline with new genetic diversity, they tightened the family circle with each union. By the 17th century, the dynasty was trapped. To marry outside would mean risking loss of territory or prestige. To continue marrying inside would mean compounding the physical and mental fragility of their heirs. They chose the latter, sealing their fate. Spain as the test case. The Spanish branch of the family bore the brunt of this experiment. Its kings were expected not only to rule but to embody Catholic strength against Protestant rivals like England and the Netherlands. Every weakness in a Spanish king had continental consequences. Philip II would double down on the marriage strategy, marrying his niece. Philip III would follow suit, marrying a cousin. By the time of Philip IV, the web of intermarriage was so tangled that his children had less genetic variety than the offspring of siblings. Charles II was the inevitable outcome, not a curse from God, but the predictable result of an experiment carried too far. A dynasty on the brink. In retrospect, the rise of the Habsburgs was a paradox. Their marriage policy made them Europe's most powerful dynasty, but it also planted the seeds of their destruction. The very strategy that built their empire guaranteed its decline. Maximilian's motto had worked brilliantly in the short term. Austria did not need to wage endless wars to expand. Its marriages won crowns instead. Yet 2 centuries later, Spain's royal nursery bore the evidence that this policy had become a deadly trap. The birth of Charles II was not a surprise twist in history. It was the logical conclusion of choices made long before he was born. His arrival in 1661 was not just the beginning of his personal tragedy but the culmination of a dynasty's dangerous gamble. If Maximilian I was the architect of the Habsburg rise, his grandson Philip II of Spain became the architect of their unraveling. His reign, from 1556 to 1598, was the height of Spain's global dominance. Yet it was also the moment when the cracks beneath that glittering surface began to split open. Philip II left Spain with staggering debts, endless wars, and an entrenched habit of dynastic inbreeding. Above all, he left his successors a vision of monarchy that demanded absolute devotion but gave little room for adaptation. The king in the Escorial. Philip II was not a flamboyant monarch. He was no Renaissance prince like his father, Charles V, who loved hunting, feasting, and moving constantly across his sprawling empire. Philip preferred solitude, prayer, and control. From his seat in the vast monastery palace of El Escorial, just outside Madrid, he ran his empire through endless paperwork. Witnesses described him spending hours hunched over documents, personally reviewing petitions, finances, and military reports. His court revolved around his strict schedule of work and prayer, with little tolerance for extravagance. Outwardly, this diligence seemed admirable. Here was a king utterly devoted to his duties, a ruler who styled himself as the tireless servant of God and Spain. But Philip's rigidity was also his greatest flaw. He lacked flexibility, distrusted delegation, and viewed compromise as weakness. Champion of Catholicism, Philip inherited from his father a sprawling empire and an equally sprawling set of enemies. The Protestant Reformation had fractured Europe, and Philip saw himself as Catholicism's chief defender. His motto might well have been, "Better to lose everything than to betray the faith." This conviction led him into wars on multiple fronts. In the Netherlands, his harsh repression of Protestant rebels fueled the 80 Years' War, a conflict that would drain Spain's treasury for generations. Against the Ottoman Empire, he launched campaigns in the Mediterranean, culminating in the naval victory at Lepanto in 1571. A triumph, but one that masked the growing weakness of Spain's fleets. Against England, he prepared the most famous disaster of his reign, the Spanish Armada of 1588, a fleet meant to overthrow Elizabeth I and restore Catholic dominance. The Armada's failure was catastrophic. Storms, poor planning, and English resistance scattered the fleet. Though Spain remained a major power, the myth of its invincibility was shattered forever. The cost of glory. Philip's wars were fueled not only by zeal but by silver. Mountains of it shipped from the mines of Potosi and Zacatecas in the New World. Ships laden with bullion docked at Seville, seemingly ensuring endless wealth for Spain. Yet this silver was a curse as much as a blessing. Instead of investing in industry, Spain relied almost entirely on imports. Silver fueled rampant inflation, raising prices while leaving peasants impoverished. By the late 16th century, Spain's economy was collapsing under its own success. The monarchy, meanwhile, spent far more than it earned. Philip declared state bankruptcy 4 separate times during his reign. Each war drained more treasure, each bankruptcy made future borrowing harder. Spain was locked into a cycle of debt that would plague it long after Philip's death, a family strategy that tightened the noose. Philip's policies extended beyond war and finance. He also advanced the Habsburg marriage strategy with renewed zeal. His marriages reflected both his personal devotion to Catholicism and his political vision of consolidating power within the family. His first wife was Maria Manuela of Portugal, his cousin, whose early death left him widowed. His second wife was the famous Mary I of England, known as Bloody Mary. This union briefly united England and Spain, but when Mary died childless, the alliance dissolved. His third wife was his niece, Elizabeth of Valois, bringing a temporary peace with France. Finally, he married another niece, Anna of Austria, cementing ties with the Austrian Habsburgs. These marriages produced heirs, but at a genetic cost. Philip's insistence on keeping the dynasty pure narrowed the bloodline even further. His children inherited not only crowns but compounded recessive traits. The shadow of Don Carlos. One of the most tragic illustrations of Philip's legacy was his son Don Carlos, born from his marriage to Maria Manuela of Portugal. Carlos was a product of intense inbreeding. His parents were double first cousins, meaning they shared all 4 grandparents. The result was disastrous. Don Carlos was sickly from birth, with a misshapen skull that required doctors to drill into it to relieve pressure. He grew up unstable, violent, and mentally disturbed. Reports describe him torturing animals, assaulting servants, and plotting rebellions against his own father. By his teenage years, Don Carlos was uncontrollable. Fearing a coup, Philip confined him to his chambers, where the prince wasted away and died at the age of 23. Whether from natural illness, neglect, or quiet poisoning remains debated, but his fate became a symbol of the dynasty's decay. The death of Don Carlos shocked Europe. Here was the heir to the most powerful empire on earth. Brilliant on paper, broken in reality. Spain's future suddenly looked much darker. The burden he left behind. Philip II ruled for 42 years, leaving behind both triumphs and catastrophes. On the one hand, he expanded Spain's empire to unprecedented heights. Control of the Philippines, named after him, dominance in the Americas, and a legacy of defending Catholicism. On the other, he left Spain nearly bankrupt, mired in endless wars, and with a royal family already showing signs of terminal decline. He was in many ways the quintessential Habsburg king, devout, stubborn, consumed with duty, and blind to the long-term consequences of his choices. He believed he was safeguarding Spain and Catholic Europe. In reality, he was digging the foundations of the grave into which his descendants, especially Charles II, would fall. A dynasty at its peak, and its tipping point. By the time Philip died in 1598, Spain was still outwardly the greatest power in Europe. But beneath the grandeur, the empire was cracking. Inflation, debt, religious wars, and inbreeding had all set the stage for decline. His son, Philip III, inherited a realm already weakened. His grandson, Philip IV, would preside over further collapse. And eventually, his great-grandson Charles II would inherit the full weight of this legacy. A frail, infertile boy asked to uphold an empire that no longer had the strength to stand. Philip II's reign is often remembered for the Armada, the Escorial, and his iron devotion to the Catholic faith. But in the long sweep of history, his greatest legacy may be the trap he set for his descendants. A dynasty locked in on itself, doomed by the very policies that had once brought it glory. When Philip II died in 1598, he left his successors both an empire and a trap. The empire stretched across continents, but the trap was financial ruin, endless wars, and a dynasty already weakened by inbreeding. His son Philip III and grandson Philip IV inherited both, and their reigns would accelerate Spain's slide from European supremacy toward the crisis embodied by Charles II. Philip III, the Forgotten King. Philip III, r. 1598 to 1621, is often remembered as one of Spain's most ineffective monarchs. Where his father had been rigid and controlling, Philip III was pious, mild, and uninterested in government. He preferred hunting and prayer over paperwork. The true power during his reign lay in the hands of his favorite, the Duke of Lerma, who effectively governed Spain for 2 decades. Under Lerma's guidance, Spain avoided some wars but bled money in others. The government relied heavily on loans, selling offices, and further debasing the currency. One of the most infamous decisions of Philip III's reign was the expulsion of the Moriscos, 1609 to 1614. These were Muslims who had converted to Christianity, often under duress, but still faced suspicion from their neighbors. An estimated 300,000 Moriscos were forced to leave Spain, many of them skilled farmers and artisans. While the expulsion was framed as a triumph of Catholic purity, in practice it crippled Spain's economy by removing a productive and tax-paying segment of society. Philip III himself seemed blissfully detached from such consequences. His reign was one of drift, a pause between the iron discipline of Philip II and the extravagance of his son Philip IV. But the empire could not afford drift. The debt continued to mount, the economy continued to wither, and the dynasty's genetic health continued to decline. Philip IV, the stage king. Philip IV, r. 1621 to 1665, came to the throne at just 16 years old. He inherited his father's debts and his grandfather's wars, but he also inherited the Habsburg obsession with grandeur. Unlike Philip III, who had been passive, Philip IV was ambitious. He loved art, theater, and spectacle. He wanted to restore Spain's image as the unrivaled leader of Europe. To achieve this, Philip relied on his own favorite and minister, Gaspar de Guzman, Count Duke of Olivares. Olivares was clever, hardworking, and determined to revive Spain's fortunes. But his methods, higher taxes, forced loans, and new military levies, only deepened resentment across the empire. The theater of decline. Philip IV's court became famous for its cultural brilliance. He was a patron of great painters like Diego Velázquez, whose portraits immortalized the king, his family, and the fragile dignity of Spain's monarchy. The theaters of Madrid thrived, with playwrights like Lope de Vega and Calderón de la Barca producing masterpieces. But the brilliance of the arts masked the rot beneath. While Velázquez painted hauntingly beautiful portraits, Spain's armies were losing battles. While plays celebrated imperial glory, provinces rebelled under the burden of taxation. Philip IV's reign became a paradox. Dazzling on the surface, disastrous underneath. The wars that bled Spain dry. The 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, dominated Philip IV's reign. Spain entered the war to defend Catholicism and Habsburg power in Central Europe, fighting alongside their Austrian cousins. At first, Spanish armies were formidable, but as the years dragged on, the costs grew unbearable. In 1640, disaster struck on multiple fronts. Catalonia revolted against Madrid's taxes and centralization, aligning briefly with France. Portugal declared independence after 60 years of Spanish rule, beginning a struggle that Spain ultimately lost. Naples and Sicily simmered with unrest. By 1648, with the Treaty of Westphalia, Spain was forced to recognize the independence of the Netherlands, a bitter humiliation after decades of war. The empire that had once seemed unshakable was crumbling, a family bound too tightly. Even as Spain's global position weakened, the dynasty continued its dangerous marriage strategy. Philip IV himself embodied the problem. His first wife, Elizabeth of France, was a valuable political match, but after her death he married his niece, Mariana of Austria. This union was intended to reinforce the bond between the Spanish and Austrian branches of the Habsburgs, but genetically, it narrowed the bloodline even further. Their children suffered the consequences. Several died in infancy. The one who survived was Charles, born in 1661. He was frail, sickly, and visibly marked by the Habsburg genetic legacy. From the moment of his birth, courtiers whispered doubts about whether he could ever rule. Velázquez's brush in the truth of power. One of the most haunting legacies of Philip IV's reign is the art of Velázquez. His portraits of the royal family, while commissioned to glorify the monarchy, also reveal its decline. The Habsburg jaw, the somber expressions, the stiff postures, Velázquez captured the tension between image and reality. In his masterpiece Las Meninas, painted in 1656, the young Infanta Margarita is shown surrounded by courtiers and attendants, while the king and queen appear only as reflections in a distant mirror. The painting is often interpreted as a meditation on the fragility of power and the illusion of control, themes that fit the Habsburgs perfectly. Velázquez may not have intended to critique his patrons, but his art endures as a silent witness to the dynasty's decline. The death of Philip IV. By the time Philip IV died in 1665, Spain was no longer the unchallenged superpower of Europe. France, under the dynamic rule of Louis XIV, was eclipsing it. Spain's finances were ruined, its armies beaten, its colonies restive. Yet the greatest crisis was not external but internal. The future of the monarchy rested on the shoulders of a child. Charles II, only 4 years old, already showing signs of frailty. His mother, Mariana of Austria, would serve as regent, but the empire required a strong king, and Charles was anything but strong. A dynasty on the edge of extinction. Philip III and Philip IV had presided over the slow-motion collapse of Spain's golden age. They had squandered the silver of the New World, expelled productive subjects, fought ruinous wars, and perpetuated the genetic experiment that weakened their heirs. When Charles II took the throne, he did so not as the scion of a rising dynasty but as the last fragile thread of a family that had spent centuries tightening its own noose. The tragedy of Charles's life was that he bore the full weight of decisions made long before his birth. When Charles II of Spain was born in 1661, the omens were bad from the start. He was the only surviving son of King Philip IV and Mariana of Austria, and from the moment he entered the world it was clear that Spain's future rested on a child who was anything but ordinary. Weak, sickly, and plagued by deformities, Charles became known to history as El Hechizado, the Bewitched King. His reign, 1665 to 1700, was less a period of active rule than a slow-motion crisis. Spain's empire teetered on the edge of collapse, its monarchy faced extinction, and its king embodied the consequences of a dynasty that had married itself into a corner. A child of inbreeding. Charles II was the product of generations of Habsburg intermarriage. His father, Philip IV, had married his own niece, Mariana of Austria. That meant Charles's mother was also his first cousin once removed. Tracing the family tree reveals that Charles's ancestry was anything but diverse. Of his 16 great-great-grandparents, only 10 were unique individuals. This genetic bottleneck expressed itself in dramatic ways. Charles inherited the notorious Habsburg jaw, so pronounced that he struggled to chew food or even close his mouth properly. He was unusually small and frail for his age, with reports describing him as unable to walk until he was 4 and unable to speak clearly until nearly the same age. His health remained fragile throughout his life, with repeated illnesses that left him weak and exhausted. The legend of the Bewitched King. In Spain, Charles's condition was often explained not by genetics but by the supernatural. Courtiers and subjects alike believed the king was cursed, the victim of sorcery or demonic influence. Priests were summoned to perform exorcisms, and the court became a hotbed of rumors about witches and spells. The nickname El Hechizado, the Bewitched, captured both pity and fear. To many Spaniards, the king's frailty was not just a family tragedy but a divine judgment on a dynasty that had become too proud, too insular, and too stubborn to change. A child king under his mother's shadow. When Philip IV died in 1665, Charles was only 4 years old. His mother, Mariana of Austria, became regent. Mariana was intelligent but isolated, relying heavily on confessors and foreign advisors. The Spanish nobility resented her influence, and rival factions constantly vied for power around the child king. As Charles grew, it became obvious that he would never be the kind of monarch Spain needed. He was unable to lead armies, struggled to participate in government, and often withdrew into illness or prayer. Yet the machinery of monarchy continued around him, using his name as a cover for decisions made by ministers and regents. Marriage and the desperate hope for an heir. The central drama of Charles II's reign was the question of succession. Could this frail king produce a child and continue the Habsburg line in Spain? In 1679, Charles married Marie-Louise of Orleans, niece of King Louis XIV of France. She was young, beautiful, and politically significant, intended to ease tensions between Spain and France. But the marriage was a failure. Charles adored her, but his health and possible impotence meant they never had children. Marie-Louise grew increasingly miserable at the rigid Spanish court and died suddenly in 1689, possibly from appendicitis, though poison was rumored, as always in the paranoid world of palace intrigue. Charles remarried quickly, this time to Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess whose family had a reputation for fertility. She too failed to produce an heir. The royal couple's childlessness became a European crisis, as rival dynasties positioned themselves to claim Spain's vast inheritance once Charles inevitably died without offspring. The empire in freefall. While Europe obsessed over Charles's health and fertility, Spain itself continued to decline. The once mighty silver fleets from the Americas dwindled, crippled by piracy, smuggling, and exhausted mines. Inflation eroded the economy, peasants groaned under taxation, and industry lagged behind that of France, England, and the Dutch Republic. Spain's armies, once feared across Europe, suffered defeat after defeat. In the War of the Spanish Succession's prelude, France under Louis XIV outmaneuvered Spain diplomatically and militarily. Territories in the Low Countries, Italy, and the Caribbean slipped from Madrid's grasp. By the 1690s, Spain was no longer a dominant power but a weakened state whose fate was being decided by stronger neighbors. A court of superstition and desperation. Charles's court became a bizarre mixture of politics and mysticism. Doctors prescribed endless treatments for the king's illnesses, potions, bleedings, exotic diets. Priests performed exorcisms, convinced that his ailments were the work of sorcery. One account describes Charles sitting through a public exorcism, shivering and weeping as prayers were shouted over him. In truth, the tragedy was biological, not magical. The Habsburgs had pushed their family tree into a genetic cul-de-sac. Charles was its final product, living proof of what happens when politics takes precedence over biology. The question of succession. As Charles aged, the great powers of Europe circled like vultures. Who would inherit Spain's empire when the king died without children? Two main candidates emerged. Louis XIV's grandson, Philip of Anjou, representing the French Bourbon dynasty. Archduke Charles of Austria, representing the Austrian Habsburgs. Both had claims through Charles's sisters and cousins, and both were backed by powerful foreign interests. The succession question became the central issue of European politics in the 1690s. Charles himself agonized over the decision. Pressured by his wife and advisors, he changed his will more than once. At times he leaned toward Austria, at others toward France. Ultimately, shortly before his death in 1700, he named Philip of Anjou as his heir, a choice that set the stage for the War of the Spanish Succession, one of the largest conflicts Europe had ever seen. The death of the last Spanish Habsburg. Charles II died on November 1, 1700, at the age of 38. His body was wasted, his mind clouded, and his kingdom exhausted. An autopsy reportedly described his corpse as full of water, without blood, his heart the size of a walnut, his lungs corroded, his intestines rotten and gangrenous, and he had only a single testicle, black as coal. Whether embellished or not, the description symbolized the collapse of a dynasty that had once ruled the world. With Charles's death, the Spanish branch of the Habsburgs ended. Centuries of careful marriage strategies, designed to preserve power, had instead led to self-destruction. The empire passed into the hands of the Bourbons, and Europe plunged into war to settle the succession. Charles II's legacy. Charles II is often mocked as weak, cursed, or grotesque. But his story is not just about personal tragedy. It is about a dynasty that pushed its own logic to the breaking point, prioritizing political marriages over genetic health, clinging to outdated economic systems, and fighting wars it could not afford. Charles was not the cause of Spain's decline, he was the symbol of it. His reign was the final chapter in a dynasty that had once dominated Europe but collapsed under the weight of its own decisions. And so, with his death, the Spanish Habsburgs ended not with a bang but with a whisper. A frail, childless king whose body bore the marks of centuries of dynastic ambition turned inward. When Charles II of Spain died childless on November 1, 1700, Europe braced for an earthquake. The Spanish Habsburg dynasty, rulers of one of the largest empires in history, had come to an end. But their empire was too vast, too valuable, and too strategic to simply pass quietly into new hands. Instead, the death of a single, frail king triggered one of the largest wars Europe had ever seen. The War of the Spanish Succession, 1701–1714. The stakes of an empty throne. The Spanish Empire in 1700 was enormous. It stretched from Spain and Portugal to vast swathes of Italy and the Low Countries, and across the oceans to colonies in the Americas, the Philippines, and parts of Africa. Whoever inherited this empire would suddenly become one of the most powerful rulers on earth. Charles II's final will named Philip of Anjou, grandson of France's King Louis XIV, as his heir. On paper this made sense. Philip's grandmother was Charles's half-sister, and the Bourbon dynasty of France was one of the few families powerful enough to protect Spain's empire from fragmentation. But to other European powers this was a nightmare. If Spain and France united under one dynasty, the balance of power in Europe would be destroyed. France, already the most powerful country on the continent, would now control Spain's colonies, silver, and trade routes. England, the Dutch Republic, Austria, and other rivals immediately saw this as unacceptable. Two princes, two Europes. The succession crisis produced two rival claimants. Philip of Anjou, Philip V of Spain, backed by France and Spain's Bourbon-aligned nobility. Archduke Charles of Austria, backed by Austria, England, the Dutch Republic, and eventually much of the Holy Roman Empire. Thus, Charles II's frail body had left behind a geopolitical bomb. His death divided Europe into two massive camps, each determined to claim Spain's inheritance. The war begins. In 1701, war broke out. The Grand Alliance, led by England, the Dutch Republic, and Austria, faced off against France and Spain, now united under Philip V. The conflict sprawled across continents. In Europe, battles raged from Flanders to Italy. At sea, the navies of England and the Dutch fought to choke off French and Spanish trade. In the Americas, colonial forces clashed in what became known as Queen Anne's War. Even in Asia, Spanish and Portuguese trade routes became contested. One of the most dramatic campaigns unfolded in Central Europe. In 1704, the Duke of Marlborough, England, and Prince Eugene of Savoy, Austria, scored a decisive victory against France at the Battle of Blenheim, preventing French dominance of southern Germany. The war quickly became a grinding stalemate with victories and defeats on both sides. Spain torn apart. Inside Spain, the war was also a civil conflict. Different regions chose different sides. Castile, the heart of Spain, largely supported Philip V and the Bourbon cause. But Catalonia, Aragon, and Valencia leaned toward Archduke Charles, fearing that Bourbon centralization would crush their local privileges. The war devastated Spain. Armies marched back and forth across the countryside, consuming food, burning villages, and spreading famine. The treasury, already exhausted by decades of decline, nearly collapsed. By the time peace finally came, Spain was a shadow of its former self. The war's turning point. By 1708, it seemed the Austrian candidate might actually win. Archduke Charles's forces advanced deep into Spain, and at one point it looked possible that he could claim Madrid itself. But then history twisted again. In 1711, Charles's brother, the Holy Roman Emperor Joseph I, died unexpectedly. Suddenly, Archduke Charles became heir to the Austrian Habsburg Empire. If he also inherited Spain, the Habsburgs would control both Austria and Spain, recreating the vast empire of Charles V from a century earlier. This alarmed England and the Dutch just as much as France's earlier ambitions had. The Grand Alliance no longer wanted Charles on the Spanish throne. A compromise had to be found. The Peace of Utrecht. After years of bloody fighting, the conflict ended with the Treaty of Utrecht, 1713, and subsequent agreements in 1714. The results redrew the map of Europe. Philip V remained King of Spain, establishing the Bourbon dynasty that still rules Spain today. But he had to renounce all claims to the French throne, ensuring France and Spain would never unite under one crown. Spain was forced to cede major territories. The Spanish Netherlands, Naples, Milan, and Sardinia went to Austria, while Gibraltar and Minorca went to Britain. Britain also gained valuable trading rights in Spanish America, including the asiento, the right to supply African slaves to Spanish colonies. The treaties reshaped Europe's balance of power. France and Spain remained strong but checked. Britain emerged as a rising maritime empire. Austria consolidated power in Central Europe. The Bourbons replaced the Habsburgs. The outcome marked a fundamental shift. For nearly 2 centuries, the Habsburgs had dominated Spain, steering it into a golden age and then a long decline. Now the dynasty was gone. The Bourbons, younger, more adaptable, and less entangled in the web of cousin marriages, brought new policies. Philip V introduced centralized administration, modeled after France, which gradually eroded the independence of regions like Catalonia. Economically, reforms began to modernize Spain, though progress was slow. The empire remained vast, but it was no longer the terrifying superpower it had been under Charles V and Philip II. The final irony of Charles II. In the end, Charles II, the bewitched king, shaped history not by what he did in life but by what he could not do, produce an heir. His sterility, the most tragic consequence of centuries of inbreeding, forced Europe into a new order. The irony was stark. The Habsburgs had pursued cousin marriages for centuries in order to keep their lands united and avoid wars of succession. Yet those very marriages produced a king who ensured the dynasty's extinction and unleashed one of the most devastating succession wars in history. The legacy of the Spanish Habsburgs. The story of the Spanish Habsburgs is more than just a tale of royal deformities or palace intrigue. It is the story of how empires rise and fall, how strategies that once bring power can, over generations, sow the seeds of decline. The dynasty reached its zenith under Charles V and Philip II, ruling half the known world. But their obsession with purity of blood and dynastic unity led to Charles II, a king too weak to continue their line. When he died, the dynasty died with him. In his place rose the Bourbons, and with them a new Europe. Epilogue: a warning from history. Today, Charles II is remembered as one of history's most tragic monarchs. A man more pitted than hated, more symbol than ruler. His life was shaped not by his own choices but by the relentless ambitions of his ancestors. His death was the end of the Spanish Habsburgs, but also the beginning of modern Europe. The War of the Spanish Succession forced powers to negotiate, compromise, and accept that no single dynasty could dominate the continent again. In that sense, Charles II, weak, cursed, and childless, accomplished what none of his mighty ancestors could. He ended the dream of universal empire, ensuring that Europe would remain a balance of nations rather than the possession of one all-powerful family. When we picture the Spanish Habsburgs today, it is often not through their policies, battles, or treaties, but through their faces. The jutting chins, elongated jaws, and heavy lower lips immortalized in oil paint have become symbols of an entire dynasty's decline. The Habsburgs were as much painted as they were remembered. From Titian to Velázquez, Europe's finest artists recorded their likenesses. These portraits, hung in palaces and cathedrals, were intended as propaganda, images of power, majesty, and divine right. Yet over centuries, they also became a kind of unintended medical record, documenting the effects of generations of inbreeding. The Habsburg jaw, a family trademark. The most notorious feature of the dynasty was the so-called Habsburg jaw. Medically, it is a form of mandibular prognathism. The lower jaw protrudes forward, causing the chin to jut and the lower lip to droop. In extreme cases, it interferes with chewing and speech. By the 16th century, the trait was already visible in Habsburg rulers across Europe. But it became most severe in the Spanish line, where cousin marriages compounded genetic inheritance. Charles V, 1500 to 1558, the emperor who ruled an empire where the sun never set, displayed a noticeable but manageable version of the jaw. Philip IV, 1605 to 1665, Charles II's father, had an elongated face with a drooping lower lip, recorded in dozens of Velázquez portraits. Charles II, 1661 to 1700, embodied the full weight of the family curse. His jaw so misshapen he struggled to chew solid food, forcing a diet of soft, liquid meals. The condition became a kind of dynastic brand, recognizable across centuries of paintings. Portraits as medical evidence. Art historians have long studied Habsburg portraits as political symbols. But in recent decades, scientists have examined them as data. In 2019, a team of geneticists and surgeons analyzed 66 portraits of 15 Habsburg rulers, comparing facial features across generations. They concluded that the severity of the jaw was directly correlated to the dynasty's inbreeding coefficient. In other words, the portraits confirmed what medical records suggested. Cousin marriages amplified the trait until it became debilitating. In this way, art unintentionally preserved the evidence of biology. The Habsburgs' most powerful propaganda tool, their majestic portraits, became the clearest window into their decline. The body of the king as symbol. In early modern Europe, monarchs were not private individuals, they were living symbols of their nations. The king's health reflected the health of the state. This meant Charles II's deformities carried a heavy political weight. His frailty was read by subjects and foreigners alike as an omen of Spain's weakness. Satirists in rival courts whispered that Spain's king was bewitched, cursed, or half dead. Even within Spain, his body became the subject of desperate rituals. Physicians prescribed bizarre treatments, bloodletting, potions of deer testicles, even ground up human skulls. Priests ordered exorcisms, convinced that demons must be tormenting the king. In reality, it was genetics, not sorcery, that had undone him. Superstition meets science. Charles's reign occurred at a moment of transition in European thought. Superstition, alchemy, and magic still shaped medicine. At the same time, the scientific revolution was spreading new ideas of biology and heredity. Yet Spain lagged behind. While scientists in England and the Netherlands dissected bodies and debated natural laws, Spanish physicians still clung to medieval theories of humors and balance. In this environment, the king's decline was interpreted less as biology than as divine judgment. Astrologers cast charts for Charles's health. Monks paraded relics through Madrid, praying for an heir. Court rumor blamed witches, curses, and evil eyes. The dynasty that had once brought silver from the New World and fleets from Asia now turned inward, obsessed with curing its king through holy water and exorcisms. The cultural memory of the Habsburg jaw. Over time, the Habsburg jaw became more than a medical condition. It became shorthand for dynastic obsession. Cartoonists in the 18th and 19th centuries lampooned the family as grotesque chins with crowns. Historians turned the jaw into a metaphor for the dangers of aristocratic isolation. In the 20th century, geneticists cited the dynasty as a case study in hereditary disease. Today, the Habsburg jaw is one of the most famous examples of what happens when political ambition overrides biological caution. It has become a symbol of decline so powerful that even those who know little of European history recognize it in portraits. Velázquez and the Paradox of Glory. The greatest chronicler of Spain's Habsburg decline was Diego Velázquez, court painter to Philip IV. His works, such as Las Meninas, remain masterpieces of European art. But look closely at his portraits of Philip IV. The drooping lip, the slack jaw, the elongated face. Velázquez painted with brutal honesty, capturing both majesty and deformity. In Velázquez's canvases, we see the paradox of the dynasty, dazzling cultural brilliance alongside biological decay. Spain's painters, writers, and composers produced masterpieces in the very same century that its rulers crumbled under the weight of their own bloodlines. Science catches up. Only centuries later could science explain what portraits had recorded. The genetic inbreeding coefficient of Charles II has been calculated at 0.254, higher than if his parents had been siblings. His ancestors' marriages created feedback loops, compounding traits like jaw deformity, infertility, and epilepsy. Today, geneticists warn of similar risks in small, isolated populations. The Spanish Habsburgs serve as a dramatic historical case study. They remind us that biology does not bend to politics. No matter how powerful a dynasty, it cannot escape the laws of inheritance. The jaw is legacy. The Spanish Habsburg line ended in 1700, but their faces remain etched in history. Walk through the Prado Museum in Madrid and you will see their story in paint. Proud kings, fragile children, and finally Charles II, pale and broken, his chin a caricature of the family curse. In those images, the jaw is more than bone, it is metaphor. It represents ambition carried too far, the dangers of insularity, the cost of ignoring nature for politics. The Habsburgs sought to preserve their empire through blood. Instead, their bloodline preserved the evidence of their decline for all to see. A dynasty remembered by its face. In the end, the Spanish Habsburgs left behind monuments, palaces, and legacies of conquest. But perhaps their most enduring legacy is their face. The Habsburg jaw has become a shorthand for the dynasty itself, as recognizable as their double-headed eagle or their imperial motto. It is the face of power turned inward, of ambition consuming itself, of history written not just in wars and treaties but in bone and blood. And when we remember Charles II, the last of the line, it is that face, fragile, distorted, tragic, that tells us the story of an empire undone by its own making. By the late 17th century, Spain was still the largest empire in Europe, stretching across oceans. Its maps showed an enormous realm: the Iberian Peninsula, vast stretches of Italy and the Low Countries, colonies from the Americas to the Philippines. To outsiders it looked like a colossus, yet beneath the gilded surface Spain was a hollow shell. When Charles II inherited the throne in 1665, he received not a flourishing kingdom but a declining empire exhausted by war, debt, and mismanagement. The story of his reign cannot be understood without the wider context of a Spain that was already unraveling. The silver that poisoned Spain. For over a century, silver from the Americas had poured into Spain's coffers. The mines of Potosí in modern Bolivia and Zacatecas in Mexico produced vast amounts of wealth. Galleons carried treasure across the Atlantic, filling the royal treasury. But what looked like prosperity was a trap. Instead of investing in industry, Spain relied on imports. Instead of building a productive economy, it spent silver on foreign wars and luxury goods. The result was inflation so extreme that ordinary Spaniards could not afford basic necessities. By the 17th century, the silver was dwindling, but the empire's dependence on it had become permanent. Debt spiraled. The government declared bankruptcy multiple times. Foreign bankers, especially in Genoa and the Netherlands, effectively controlled Spain's finances. Spain was rich in theory but poor in practice. A society of idlers and burdens. Economic decline was worsened by social structure. Spain's nobility, obsessed with honor, considered manual labor beneath them. Ambitious families pushed their sons into the clergy or bureaucracy rather than commerce or industry. The economy lacked a strong middle class. The expulsion of the Moriscos under Philip III had already removed hundreds of thousands of skilled workers. The burden of taxation fell on peasants, while nobles and clergy were largely exempt. The result was a society where productivity shrank, but taxation grew heavier. By Charles II's reign, famine was common, rural depopulation spread, and Madrid was filled with beggars. The image of Spain as a land of hidalgos, gentlemen, had a dark reality. Many of those hidalgos were impoverished, clinging to titles while their estates withered. The decline of Spanish power. On the battlefield, Spain's decline was just as stark. Once Europe's most feared military, the tercios, Spain's elite infantry units, had dominated wars in the 16th century. But by the mid-17th century they were outdated. New tactics, pioneered by the Dutch and the French, left Spanish armies struggling. Naval power too declined. The great treasure fleets became vulnerable to piracy and rival navies. England, France, and the Dutch Republic all chipped away at Spanish dominance overseas. The Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, had already forced Spain to recognize Dutch independence, and the Treaty of the Pyrenees, 1659, ceded territory to France. By the time Charles II came of age, Spain was no longer the hegemon of Europe but a second-rate power clinging to past glory. The Catholic Church and the burden of faith. Religion remained central to Spanish identity, but its dominance stifled reform. The Inquisition still operated, policing thought and punishing heresy. Mysticism, relic cults, and exorcisms flourished. While Protestant nations embraced scientific inquiry, Spain turned inward. Universities taught theology more than science. Books were censored. The Church absorbed enormous wealth while discouraging innovation. For Charles II personally, religion was both solace and prison. His illnesses were interpreted as spiritual battles. Priests prescribed exorcisms and relic processions alongside medicine. The monarchy, once seen as God's chosen instrument, seemed cursed, and many Spaniards interpreted this as divine punishment for the sins of the nation. Culture in a time of ruin. Ironically, Spain's cultural life thrived even as its economy collapsed. The 17th century produced some of Europe's greatest art, literature, and theater. This was Spain's siglo de oro or golden age, though by Charles's reign, it was more twilight than dawn. Literature. Writers like Miguel de Cervantes earlier in the century and dramatists like Lope de Vega and Calderón de la Barca filled Spain with plays and novels that examined honor, fate, and illusion. Calderón's Life is a Dream, 1635, captured the philosophical mood of a society questioning reality itself. Art. Painters like Diego Velázquez and later Murillo immortalized both royalty and commoners with unmatched depth. Velázquez, especially, revealed the humanity behind the grandeur of Philip IV's court. Architecture. Baroque churches and palaces rose across Spain, symbols of religious devotion and imperial pride, even as famine stalked the countryside. The paradox was striking. While Spain's people suffered, its artists produced works of genius that endure to this day. Everyday life under Charles II. For ordinary Spaniards, life under Charles II was grim. Harvest failures led to periodic famines. Epidemics of plague swept through towns. Taxes were crushing, and many villages saw their populations dwindle. At the same time, court life in Madrid remained extravagant. Nobles paraded in costly silks, plays entertained the capital, and religious festivals consumed resources. The gap between appearance and reality, wealth in the capital, misery in the provinces, widened dangerously. The king himself, sickly and childless, became a symbol of national anxiety. Gossip about his health circulated in taverns and marketplaces. Was Spain doomed to lose its king as it had lost its strength? Spain in the eyes of Europe. Foreign observers noted the contrast. French and English diplomats described Spain as an old giant, magnificent in appearance but broken within. Travelers wrote of deserted villages, decayed farmland, and ragged peasants. Yet they also marveled at Spain's culture and ceremony. Madrid dazzled with its palaces and processions. The Spanish court, though weakened, still projected grandeur. But underneath it was clear. France under Louis XIV had become the new superpower, and Spain was fading into the role of junior partner. The empire without energy. Despite Spain's internal decay, its overseas empire remained vast. In the Americas, cities like Mexico City and Lima thrived as colonial capitals. Manila connected Asia to Europe through the galleon trade. But these colonies were often more dynamic than Spain itself. Local elites grew powerful, trade networks flourished, and colonial societies developed their own identities. Spain extracted wealth but failed to nurture economic growth at home. By Charles II's reign, the colonies were both Spain's greatest asset and its greatest weakness. They kept the monarchy afloat, but they also highlighted the contrast between imperial appearance and domestic stagnation. Decline as destiny. For Spaniards of the late 17th century, decline felt inevitable, almost a destiny. Writers described the nation as a once great body now aged and weary. Sermons interpreted disasters as divine warnings. Even Spain's victories were temporary, outweighed by long-term losses. And at the center of it all was the monarchy, a dynasty whose body was as fragile as the empire it ruled. Charles II, weak and childless, personified the nation. His struggles to live mirrored Spain's struggles to endure. The fading giant. By the time Charles II approached the end of his reign in 1700, Spain was no longer the master of Europe. It remained vast, but its power was brittle. Its economy was stagnant, its armies outdated, its people burdened, its king frail. What remained was reputation, the memory of past greatness, the symbols of empire, the rituals of monarchy. Spain was still feared and respected, but no longer dominant. In this sense, the Spain of Charles II was a ghost of its former self, haunting, majestic, and tragic. By the late 1690s, the Spanish Empire seemed to be holding its breath. Charles II, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, was approaching the end of his life. His reign had been marked by weakness, superstition, and failure to produce an heir. Now, with his body breaking down and his mind clouded, all of Europe waited for the inevitable. The final decline. Charles's health, never robust, collapsed entirely in his last decade. He suffered seizures, hallucinations, and constant digestive problems. His body wasted away until, as contemporaries said, he was little more than skin and bone. His speech was slurred, his movements clumsy, his appetite limited to soft foods and liquids. By 1696 he could no longer walk unaided. Servants carried him from chamber to chamber in the palace. His paranoia deepened. He believed he was cursed, that witches had stolen his health, that evil forces prevented him from fathering children. Priests and courtiers fed these fears, staging exorcisms and surrounding him with relics. Maria Anna of Neuburg, his second wife, never conceived. Whispers of impotence and sterility circulated openly. The court's despair was palpable. Without an heir, Spain faced a dynastic crisis that threatened not only the throne but the stability of all Europe. The autopsy of a broken king. Charles II died on November 1, 1700, at the age of 38. His death was greeted with a mixture of sorrow, relief, and dread. The autopsy shocked even hardened physicians. They reported that his body was deformed and wasted. His heart was the size of a walnut. His intestines were rotten and putrefied. His body contained no blood. His testicles, the doctors wrote bluntly, were atrophied. Whether every detail was accurate or exaggerated, the report confirmed what everyone suspected. Charles was physically incapable of fathering children. The Habsburg experiment in dynastic inbreeding had reached its tragic end, the succession question. But Charles's death did not just end a dynasty, it destabilized Europe. The question of who would inherit the Spanish crown had haunted his entire reign. Spain's empire was too vast and valuable to be left undecided. There were two major claimants: the Austrian Habsburgs through Charles's mother, Mariana of Austria; the French Bourbons through Charles's half-sister Maria Theresa, who had married Louis XIV of France. Both lines had legitimate claims, but if either inherited the whole Spanish Empire, the balance of power in Europe would shatter. A Bourbon Spain would mean near total dominance for France. A Habsburg Spain would restore Habsburg supremacy in Central Europe. Charles's will. In his final act, Charles II made the decision that would plunge Europe into war. He named Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV, as his heir. Philip was young, healthy, and, most importantly, Bourbon. Charles hoped this choice would preserve Spain's empire intact, while ensuring it would not be carved up by rival powers. The will included a condition: Philip must renounce any claim to the French throne, to prevent the union of France and Spain under one crown. But Louis XIV, never one to miss an opportunity, saw the inheritance as a chance to expand French power to its zenith. The War of Spanish Succession. The reaction was immediate. England, the Dutch Republic, and Austria refused to allow France to dominate Europe. In 1701, the War of Spanish Succession erupted, one of the largest and most destructive conflicts of the early modern period. The war was fought across Europe, from the Low Countries to Italy to Spain itself, and even spilled into colonial theaters. Some of Europe's greatest generals, including the Duke of Marlborough and Prince Eugene of Savoy, rose to prominence during the struggle. The stakes were enormous: the fate of Spain's empire, the balance of European power, and the survival of entire dynasties hung in the balance. The Treaty of Utrecht. After more than a decade of bloody conflict, exhaustion forced peace. The Treaty of Utrecht, 1713, reshaped Europe. Philip V, grandson of Louis XIV, was confirmed as King of Spain, the first Bourbon monarch of Spain. But Spain's European holdings were carved up. Austria gained the Spanish Netherlands, Naples, Milan, and Sardinia. Britain gained Gibraltar and Minorca, as well as rights to trade in Spanish America. The French and Spanish crowns were formally separated, preventing a united Bourbon superstate. The war ended with compromise. Spain remained intact as a kingdom, but no longer as an empire dominating Europe. The end of the Spanish Habsburgs. Charles II's death marked the extinction of the Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty. The Austrian line continued, but the dream of a united Habsburg world empire was gone forever. Historians often see Charles II not only as the last Spanish Habsburg but also as a symbol of decline, a man whose frail body reflected the exhausted empire he ruled. His life was shaped by choices made long before his birth. Centuries of dynastic marriages meant to preserve power but which, in the end, destroyed it. Legacy of Charles II. Was Charles II to blame for Spain's decline? In truth, he was more victim than cause. His disabilities, sterility, and paranoia were the result of genetic fate and dynastic policy. The decline of Spain had begun long before his reign, shaped by economic mismanagement, military defeats, and social stagnation. But as king, Charles became the focus of anxieties and hopes. His failure to produce an heir was not simply a personal tragedy but a political catastrophe. His death triggered a war that redrew Europe's map and ended Spain's era as the preeminent world power. A cautionary tale. The story of Charles II and the Spanish Habsburgs is often told as a warning. Dynastic obsession with purity and political calculation blinded rulers to biological reality. Inbreeding that was meant to preserve the dynasty instead destroyed it. Spain's decline shows how empires can appear strong but rot from within. Wealth, titles, and ceremony cannot replace productivity, reform, or adaptability. And Charles himself is a reminder of the limits of power. Even a king cannot escape the consequences of history, genetics, and human frailty. Epilogue. In 1700, as Charles II's coffin was lowered into the crypt of El Escorial, the great Habsburg monastery palace outside Madrid, a chapter of history closed. Spain had once been the most powerful empire on earth. Now, under the shadow of a broken king, it passed into the hands of a new dynasty. The Bourbon era had begun. The Habsburg age was over. And Charles II, remembered as El Hechizado, the Bewitched, remains one of history's most haunting symbols, the king who embodied both the grandeur and the ruin of an empire.